1907, India. 12 girls found hidden in a temple wall. It began with a single crack in the stone. In the summer of 1907, the rains came early to Kanchipuram, a quiet temple town in southern India. The skies turned gray for weeks, and the monsoon wind howled through the coconut palms. Inside the crumbling Veerbhadra temple, the head priest noticed a deep fissure spreading along the wall behind the sanctum, the same wall that had stood untouched for generations. When a chunk of plaster finally gave way, something impossible stared back. Not dust, not bricks, but a small, pale hand. For a moment, no one moved. The priest dropped his oil lamp, the flame hissing out in the rainwater running through the floor cracks. A few villagers rushed in with torches, expecting a relic, a statue, anything but what they saw. The light flickered over a section of the temple wall that was hollow inside, and behind it, the outlines of bodies, tiny, frail, pressed together as if sleeping upright. 12 of them, all girls. The screams echoed across the courtyard, cutting through the thunder. Women from nearby homes ran to the temple, clutching their children close. Men followed with lanterns, their sandals slapping in the mud. In the chaos, someone shouted to seal the temple gates. Others yelled to fetch the police. But everyone could already feel it, a dark, sacred silence that didn't belong to the storm. By nightfall, the story spread like fire. They said the wall had been weeping blood. They said the girls' faces looked peaceful, untouched by decay even after years. Some swore they recognized one, the daughter of a potter who vanished 2 summers ago. Another villager whispered that these were not victims, but chosen ones, sacrificed in secret rituals that had been whispered about for decades. The district police arrived from Madras Presidency, led by a young inspector named Edward Mills, who had only been in India for 6 months. The scene that greeted him was beyond comprehension, a temple draped in garlands, now ringed by frightened villagers and guarded by men with rifles. Inside, the air smelled of sandalwood, wet stone, and death. When they broke open more of the wall, they found thin wooden idols and scraps of hand-woven cloth pressed tightly between the bodies. One of the girls still wore a silver anklet, dull with age. There were no coffins, no inscriptions, just silence. Edward Mills tried to speak to the head priest, but the man had fallen into a trance-like muttering. She asked for them. The mother asked. He repeated the same phrase until his voice cracked. The inspector ordered the entire temple sealed for investigation, but by dawn, half the villagers had fled. Chickens left untended, fires still burning in clay stoves. Everyone vanished into the fields. They feared the goddess had been angered, that the dead girls' spirits would rise with the monsoon wind. That night, lightning struck the temple's highest spire. Some said it was nature. Others said it was retribution. In the official records, the discovery would later be marked as 12 unidentified female remains, estimated age, 8 to 14 years. But in Kanchipuram, the people whispered a different story. They said those girls never left, that their voices still fluttered through the temple halls when the rain began to fall. Mothers warned their children not to go near the shrine after dark. Even decades later, travelers spoke of hearing faint songs carried on the wind, lullabies with no words, only the sound of grief. The discovery that began as an accident had opened something far deeper, not just the wall of a temple, but the wall that hid a century of silence. And somewhere beneath the cracked stone and thunder, a secret waited to be uncovered, one that began long before 1907. Long before the wall cracked open, the temple had a voice of its own. It was said that if you stood near the sanctum of Veerbhadra temple after midnight, you could hear a faint hum beneath the stone floor, a vibration that seemed to rise from deep underground. The villagers called it the breathing of the goddess. The priests called it the sound of devotion. But the children of Kanchipuram gave it another name, the whispers beneath the stones. At first, no one thought much of it. The temple was centuries old, built during the late Chola reign, its foundations carved into ancient rock. Cracks and echoes were normal. But around 1905, strange things began to happen. Offerings left at the sanctum would vanish overnight. Flowers would appear on the altar before dawn, even when the temple was locked. And more unsettlingly, villagers claimed to hear weeping behind the inner walls. Soft, rhythmic, like someone mourning in secret. One woman, Lakshmi, who lived across from the temple, swore she saw small shadows move past the carved stone pillars when no priests were inside. It sounded like girls giggling, she told her husband, then crying. He laughed at first, until one night he saw two. But when they told the head priest, Pandit Narayan Shastri, he dismissed it as imagination. The gods test our minds, he said calmly. Not every sound is meant for human ears. Yet, even he had begun locking the sanctum earlier than usual and burning extra incense, enough to choke the air. The whispers grew louder as the rains drew near. One evening, a wandering Devadasi, a temple dancer named Madhura, came to offer a performance for the deity. She had performed in countless shrines before, but she hesitated at the entrance of Veerbhadra temple. Something about the air felt wrong. Heavy, expectant. When she began to dance, the drums echoed strangely, as if coming from beneath her feet instead of the musicians behind her. Her anklets clinked in rhythm, but with every turn, she felt unseen eyes watching her from the walls. In the middle of her final pose, her hand brushed the stone wall, and she froze. It was warm. Not from sunlight, not from friction. The wall itself was breathing. Madhura dropped to her knees, trembling. She refused to perform again. That night, she left the village without saying a word. Weeks later, her body was found by the riverbank, her mouth filled with temple flowers. The local magistrate called it suicide. The villagers called it a warning. By the start of 1907, parents began forbidding their daughters from visiting the temple. But traditions die slowly in India. Every full moon, people still came with lamps and offerings. They still sang hymns to the fierce god Veerbhadra, the warrior aspect of Shiva, hoping to keep the goddess's anger asleep. Yet behind the idols, behind the draped curtains and layers of prayer smoke, something was stirring. A small sound beneath the sacred stones. The faint scrape of fingernails. The sigh of air through a sealed wall. And then, one morning, a little girl named Kamala vanished. She had been seen playing near the temple steps just before dusk, chasing fireflies with her friends. When the others turned around, she was gone. Her sandals lay near the door. No one saw her leave. The villagers searched the fields, the wells, the forests. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a sound. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. Some say the gods demand faith. Others say the earth remembers every secret buried within it. In 1907, the line between faith and fear blurred forever in Kanchipuram, because soon Kamala wouldn't be the only one to vanish. And when the rains returned, the temple itself would tell the truth. It began with one missing child, but it did not end there. After Kamala vanished near the temple steps, panic spread through Kanchipuram like a sickness no prayer could cure. Mothers clutched their daughters close. Fathers refused to let them fetch water alone, and the once busy temple courtyard grew silent. But the silence didn't last long, because only 2 weeks later, another girl disappeared. Her name was Savitri, the daughter of a local weaver. She was 12, bright, and always wore red ribbons in her hair. On the morning she vanished, her mother said she had gone to gather flowers for the shrine, as she did every dawn. The sun rose, the other children returned, but Savitri never did. Her ribbons were later found tangled in the thorn bushes near the temple wall. Over the next 6 months, 10 more girls vanished, one by one, from nearby villages that circled the temple like petals around a lotus. The disappearances followed no pattern. Some girls were from wealthy families, others from the poorest huts. Some vanished in daylight, others during storms. Yet one detail was always the same. Each girl had visited the temple days before she disappeared. The police reports from the time described the cases as isolated rural abductions, blaming bandits, tigers, even famine migration. But those who lived in Kanchipuram knew better. They saw the connection. They felt it. Each time a girl vanished, the temple bells would ring by themselves that night, long, slow chimes that echoed through the dark fields. The priests said it was the wind. The villagers said it was a calling. Rumors began to form a story, and that story spread faster than the truth. Some whispered that the goddess inside the temple, Devi Kalika, the silent consort of Virabhadra, demanded young lives to remain appeased. Others claimed the priests were performing ancient tantric rituals, long outlawed under British rule, meant to summon divine power through sacrifice. Still, there were those who believed something even stranger, that the temple itself was alive, a breathing being that absorbed the innocent to keep its own spirit awake. When Inspector Edward Mills first heard the villagers' complaints, he dismissed them as superstition. 12 girls can't just disappear into thin air, he told his assistant. There's a man behind this. But as he walked through the temple gates for the first time, even he felt something wrong in the air, something he couldn't name. The place smelled not of incense, but of wet limestone and rot, a faint odor of decay masked by jasmine garlands. He ordered a search of the surrounding fields, ponds, and even the old burial grounds. Nothing. Not a single trace. No footprints, no signs of struggle. It was as if the girls had walked into the earth and never come out again. Then came the letter. One night, as the rain hammered on the station roof, a messenger arrived carrying an unsigned note written in uneven Tamil script. It read only 6 words, "They sleep behind the goddess's eyes." Mills was baffled. He took it as a threat, at first a cruel prank. But the next morning, when his team searched the temple sanctum again, he noticed something he hadn't before. 2 large gemstone eyes embedded in the idol of the goddess. Both were uneven. One gleamed red in torchlight, the other dull and lifeless, as though something had been buried behind it. He ordered that section of the wall examined, but the priests refused. They said the goddess's image must never be touched, that even looking behind her eyes would invite a curse upon the entire region. Mills, frustrated, backed off, at least for the moment. He didn't know it then, but he had stood just feet away from the truth. By late summer of 1907, the monsoon clouds thickened again over Kanchipuram. 12 girls were missing, the villagers restless, and the priests more secretive than ever. Offerings at the temple doubled. Night ceremonies were held in whispers, torches hidden under cloth. And deep inside the sanctum, behind layers of stone, the wall began to breathe again. The same wall that, months later, would split open to reveal what the rains had tried to hide. The truth, as it began to unravel, did not start with murder. It began with faith. Long before the British arrived, the Virabhadra temple was a place of fierce devotion, known for its rituals of purification, where fire, ash, and blood symbolized rebirth. The goddess worshipped there was not gentle. She was Kalika Devi, a deity of silence and power, believed to guard the souls of the innocent. For centuries, the priests had followed ancient customs, offerings of milk, coconuts, and incense at the full moon. But as the old priesthood aged and new keepers rose, something changed. Somewhere between reverence and desperation, a single priest, Pandit Narayan Shastri, decided that the goddess demanded more. He had lost his only daughter, Meera, to fever the year before. Her death broke him in a way that prayer could not mend. The villagers said he began hearing her voice in the temple at night, calling from behind the sanctum walls. At first, he dismissed it as grief. But when he found small footprints near the inner altar one morning, prints that could not have come from any living child, he believed the goddess had taken Meera's spirit into herself. That was when the rituals began to change. Shastri reopened forgotten scriptures, ones older priests refused to touch. They spoke of an ancient rite called the Prasamarpana, the offering of breath, a ceremony meant to preserve the voice of the dead through the bodies of the living. It required purity, innocence, youth. He told his closest disciples that the goddess had chosen 12 vessels, 12 girls, who would carry her silence into eternity. Some believed him, others did not. But no one dared challenge the word of the head priest. One by one, the chosen girls were brought to the temple under the guise of initiation rituals. Parents trusted Shastri, after all, who would question a man who'd served the gods for 40 years. The ceremonies were said to bring blessings, to make daughters brides of the divine. None returned home. The priests told the families that the girls had been taken to a convent for spiritual service in Madras. The families wept, but believed. For a time. Then came the night the ritual failed. It was the monsoon of 1906, and lightning split the temple sky as the ceremony began. The 12 girls stood in white cloth before the altar, chanting words they didn't understand. Shastri led them in prayer, his voice trembling between devotion and madness. But as he raised the ritual dagger, a gust of wind blew out every lamp in the sanctum. Darkness swallowed the temple. When the lights were relit, the smallest girl, a 9-year-old named Lalitha, was missing. Panic broke the silence. The other priests searched, calling her name, but all they heard was the faint sound of weeping from inside the wall. They tore down the curtain, and there it was. A section of stone had shifted open, revealing a narrow passage neither Shastri nor anyone else had seen before. What lay inside would haunt them forever. A small chamber carved centuries ago. On its walls, faint markings, symbols of sacrifice, and a line of empty niches shaped like human forms. Shastri fell to his knees. He said the goddess herself had accepted Lalitha, that the ritual was complete. The other priests, terrified, sealed the opening again and vowed never to speak of it. But Shastri was no longer a man. He was consumed by what he called the divine silence. In the months that followed, 11 more girls vanished, each during a storm, each offering said to please the goddess. The temple's chants grew louder. The villagers grew suspicious. And yet, not a soul dared to confront the priest, until the British inspector came. By then, Shastri's eyes had gone glassy. His voice broke in whispers, murmuring the same line again and again. The goddess sleeps behind her children. No one knew what he meant. Not until the day the wall cracked open and the rains washed the plaster away. In the candlelight of that moment, Inspector Mills understood what had truly happened. Not a curse, not a legend, but a ritual gone wrong, turned into horror by grief and blind belief. The goddess had never asked for them. A man had. And through his madness, 12 innocent souls were sealed away, sacrifices to a silence that was never divine. The telegram reached Madras Presidency headquarters on a humid July morning in 1907. A crumbling wall in Kanchipuram had revealed human remains inside a temple, 12 in total, all believed to be young girls. At first, the message was dismissed as another village superstition, but when word reached District Magistrate Henry Wallace, he sent his most capable officer, Inspector Edward Mills, to investigate. Mills was 32, freshly assigned to colonial service, and known for his skepticism toward native ghost stories. But Kanchipuram would test every conviction he had. When his train pulled into the small rural station, the air was thick with the scent of wet soil and fear. The villagers refused to meet his gaze. The few who did whispered only one word, Devi. The inspector's arrival brought uneasy order. His men established a perimeter around the temple, pushing back crowds of mourners and curiosity seekers. He stepped through the temple gates just as the evening rain began to fall, and the moment he entered, something shifted, a stillness, a strange hum beneath the floor, like a faint breath echoing through the stone. Mills shook it off as imagination, but even he could not ignore the atmosphere. The once holy site had turned cold, heavy, oppressive. Oil lamps flickered though there was no wind. The idols stared down with jewel-bright eyes that seemed to follow him as he walked. The scent of sandalwood couldn't mask the darker smell underneath, the sour odor of death. Inside the sanctum, the scene awaited him. A gaping hole in the temple wall. A cluster of pale shapes within. The police lanterns cast trembling light over what lay inside. 12 small forms, each standing upright, their arms folded across their chests, their faces eerily calm. Wrapped in decayed silk, adorned with the faint remains of flowers that had long since dried into dust. Mills froze. His rational mind tried to categorize what he saw, some kind of ancient burial, perhaps a forgotten tomb built within the temple structure. But these weren't remains of antiquity. They were too recent. He turned to the trembling priest beside him. Who did this? The priest looked down, tears streaking his ash-covered face. The goddess took them, he whispered. Mills slammed his notebook shut. The goddess doesn't build walls, pundit. Men do. Over the next few days, the inspector began interviewing villagers, gathering statements that all pointed to the same figure, Pandit Narayan Shastri, the temple's head priest. But Shastri was nowhere to be found. His quarters stood empty, the door locked from the outside. On the table lay open scriptures filled with diagrams of human forms and verses written in blood, prayers invoking silence, preservation, and rebirth. Mills sent word for his arrest, but the locals warned him not to pursue it. Some men, one elder said, are already gods to those who believe. Late one night, Mills returned to the temple alone. He wanted to see the chamber once more before the bodies were removed for examination. As he entered the sanctum, lightning flared through the open roof, illuminating the carved idol of the goddess. For an instant, her face seemed alive, eyes gleaming, lips almost curved into a smile. Then, faintly, he heard it, a whisper behind the wall. He froze. The sound was unmistakable, soft weeping, the kind a child makes in her sleep. He leaned closer. His breath fogged against the cold stone, and beneath it, he thought he heard a name. Mira, he stumbled back, heart hammering. Mira, the name of the priest's dead daughter. He'd read it in the temple records earlier that day. The same daughter whose death had driven Shastri into obsession. Was this grief made manifest? Madness lingering in the walls? Or something far worse, something real? The next morning, Mills ordered the section of the wall fully dismantled despite local protests. Behind the seal chamber, his men found a second hidden room, smaller, darker. Inside lay ceremonial tools, dry garlands, and a shallow stone basin filled with what looked like congealed ash and flower petals. Embedded into the basin's rim were tiny teeth. Human. Mills turned away, his stomach twisting. The colonial authorities soon called it a case of ritual homicide, though they had no suspect in custody and no witnesses willing to speak. Shastri had vanished into the jungles beyond the temple town, never seen again. For the official report, Mills wrote, the temple structure concealed remains of 12 minor females. Ritual intent suspected. Local priest missing. Investigation ongoing. But in his private diary, he wrote something else, something he never showed anyone. When I touched the wall tonight, it was warm. When dawn broke over Kanchipuram, a dense fog rolled through the temple courtyard, wrapping every idol and pillar in gray silence. The monsoon had eased, but the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fear. For the first time in its 300-year history, the Veerbhadra temple was no longer a place of worship. It was a crime scene. Inspector Edward Mills stood beside the collapsed section of the wall, his boots sinking into the mud-soaked floor. Around him, a small team of constables worked with hammers and chisels, breaking away centuries of plaster and stone. Every strike of metal echoed through the empty hall like thunder. Villagers gathered at a distance, whispering prayers, their eyes fixed on the gaping wound in the temple. They believed what hid behind that wall wasn't meant for human eyes. And as the last layer of stone fell, it seemed they were right. A gush of stale air burst out, thick, sour, suffocating. Mills covered his mouth as the lantern light flickered into the darkness. The chamber beyond was small, barely 6 feet deep, its walls carved with faint Sanskrit verses now blurred by moisture and mold. In the center stood a platform made of granite, stained black. And on the walls around it, shallow recesses, 12 in total. The constables froze. Each recess was large enough to fit a human body. Mills stepped closer, heart pounding. He had seen death before, famine victims, plague corpses, battlefield graves, but this was different. This was deliberate. Each niche had been carefully sealed with clay and cloth, a flower pressed into the center, as though marking a grave. "Open one," he ordered. The first blow cracked the clay. The second released a slow crumble of powder, and then a small hand fell through. The men recoiled in horror. Beneath the clay was a young girl, her body preserved unnaturally, skin pale as ivory. Her eyes were closed, her lips slightly parted, as if she were still breathing. Around her neck hung a thread of red beads. "God in heaven," one constable muttered. But Mills didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, his pulse roaring in his ears. He motioned to uncover the rest. One by one, the chambers opened, 12 girls in total, arranged in a perfect semicircle, all facing the inner sanctum, their arms folded across their chests. Each wore remnants of ceremonial dress. Each had a line of dried ash painted across her forehead, and behind each, carved faintly into the wall, was the same Sanskrit phrase: "Silence is devotion. Devotion is silence." The inspector ordered the site cordoned off. The local priests wailed outside, some begging the officers to stop, others fainting from shock. They warned that breaking the seal of the goddess would curse them all. But Mills pressed on, determined to record every inch of the chamber. His lantern caught something glinting in the corner, a small bronze idol, half buried in dust. He picked it up. The figure was of a woman, mouth covered by her own hands, eyes closed. At its base were words etched in Tamil: "She keeps what is given." A chill ran through him. By nightfall, rain began to fall again, steady and relentless. The villagers refused to bring food or water to the investigators, claiming the goddess was watching. Only an elderly caretaker, the temple's former gatekeeper, Sundar, lingered near the entrance, clutching his rosary, eyes hollow with guilt. When Mills approached him, the old man trembled. "I told them not to seal the wall," he whispered. "But the priest said the girls would wake the goddess. He said they would become her voice." "Did you see it happen?" Mills asked quietly. Sundar's eyes filled with tears. "I heard it," he said. "The chanting, the cries. Then nothing. After that night, the temple never slept. Sometimes I still hear them breathing." Mills stared into the dark chamber one last time. The lantern light wavered, and for a brief second, it seemed the girls' faces shifted, not decaying, not lifeless, but peaceful. As if they weren't trapped, but guarding something. He turned to leave, but a sudden crack split the silence. A section of the wall behind the idol had caved in, revealing a deeper void, an even smaller passage beyond. The constables stepped forward nervously. "Another room?" one asked. Mills didn't answer. His lantern shone into the narrow space, where faint carvings lined the stone. But there were no more recesses, no bodies, just a single message written in red pigment across the back wall: "Do not wake what chose to sleep." The inspector ordered the second chamber sealed immediately. But as he left the temple that night, the wind picked up again, and in its sigh, faint and distant, came the sound of children laughing, echoing through the sacred halls of stone. For days after the chamber's discovery, Kanchipuram fell under a haunting stillness. The rain refused to stop. Birds no longer sang near the temple grounds. And in the evenings, villagers swore that lamps lit themselves inside the sanctum, though no one dared step close enough to see. Inspector Mills had the area barricaded and stationed guards at the temple entrance, but even the constables grew uneasy. Men who once stood firm with rifles began refusing night shifts. One claimed to hear children humming near the sealed door. Another swore he saw small footprints in the wet mud after every storm. The inspector ignored them. At least, he tried to. But then came Sundar, the old gatekeeper, the only man who hadn't fled. It was the third night after the excavation when Sundar appeared outside the police camp. His clothes were drenched, his eyes red from crying. He clutched a small palm leaf notebook close to his chest. "I can't keep it anymore," he said in a trembling voice. "She comes to me in dreams. The little ones, they don't stop crying." Mills sat him down beside the fire, offering him tea he didn't touch. The old man's hands shook so violently that the notebook nearly slipped from his grip. "What do you mean, she comes to you?" Mills asked gently. Sundar looked up, his lips quivering. "I was there," he whispered, "when Pandit Shastri began the rituals. I helped build the wall." The inspector froze. "You helped?" "I didn't know what it was for." Sundar's voice cracked. "He told me the goddess demanded a resting place for her chosen. I was only a servant. I mixed the clay, carried the stones. I heard the chanting inside. I thought it was a prayer." He buried his face in his hands. But it wasn't. It was screaming. Through halting words and sobs, Sundar told his story. In 1906, the year before the discovery, Shastri had summoned 12 girls under the guise of divine service. Their parents had been told it was a blessing, a sacred offering of song and dance. The girls were dressed in white, given sweets and flowers, and taken into the sanctum for what was said to be an initiation ritual. Sundar was outside, sealing the outer gate when the lamps flickered. He heard chanting grow frantic, and then silence. Moments later, Shastri emerged, drenched in sweat, eyes distant and unfocused. "She is awake," he told Sundar. "The mother has accepted them." He ordered the inner wall to be sealed at once. Sundar, confused and terrified, obeyed. He said they were sleeping, that the goddess would keep them safe forever. I wanted to believe him, but his voice faltered. Sometimes, when the temple was empty, I heard knocking from inside. Mills stared at him, horrified. "And you did nothing?" Tears streamed down the old man's face. "What could I do? He was a priest. I was no one." Sundar opened the notebook then, its pages yellowed, written in a shaky Tamil script. "I wrote what I saw," he said. "Every night. Every sound." Mills couldn't read Tamil, but even he understood the drawings. Sketches of 12 girls standing before an altar, a wall behind them marked with symbols, and above them, the image of a goddess with no mouth. At the bottom of one page was a phrase written in English, as though for the inspector himself. "Silence is not peace. Silence is hunger." By dawn, Sundar was gone. His bedroll lay untouched, his lantern still burning beside it. The guard said he'd walked into the temple just before sunrise, barefoot, mumbling prayers. When Mills rushed there moments later, the courtyard was empty. Only his footprints led up to the sanctum door and stopped. The temple was locked from the inside. The inspector called for men to break it open, but when they did, they found nothing. No Sundar. No struggle. Only the faint scent of sandalwood smoke curling from the inner chamber. The same scent that always appeared before the rain. And on the floor before the sealed wall, a single line written in fresh ash. "Forgive me, Mother. I have returned them." That night, Mills wrote in his diary again. "The wall feels alive. The silence here isn't empty. It listens." I don't think Shastri ever ran. I think he stayed, just like Sundar. And they're both still inside. By mid-August 1907, the temple had turned into something more than a mystery. It had become a wound in the heart of Kanchipuram. Nobody spoke of it openly, but everyone felt its weight. The villagers stopped lighting lamps near the entrance. Mothers warned their children not to play near the banyan trees. Even stray dogs refused to cross the outer courtyard. Inspector Mills stayed, though most of his men begged to leave. His obsession had grown, not out of curiosity anymore, but something heavier. Guilt. The more he read Sundar's notebook, the more he sensed that this wasn't just a crime of man, but of faith gone blind. Each night, he returned to the temple with his lantern, tracing the ancient carvings that seemed to shift in the firelight. Among the hundreds of Sanskrit verses etched into the stone, one phrase repeated again and again, a name, Mauna Devi, the goddess of silence. He had heard of her before in whispers among villagers. A local deity, they said, who punished those who broke sacred vows. A goddess who demanded offerings not in words, but in stillness. Mills thought it was superstition. But the deeper he went, the less certain he became. On the morning of August 14th, Mills received a telegram from Madras headquarters. The government was ordering him to seal the temple entirely and report back within a week. They were sending a demolition team. The British officials had decided that superstition had no place in their records. That night, Mills couldn't sleep. He sat under the banyan tree, notebook in hand, staring at the fog-shrouded temple. The rain had stopped, but the air felt heavier than ever. He began to write, "If Mount Devi is silence, then what happens when we destroy her house? Do we silence the screams, or do we release them?" Then he heard it. A hum. Faint. Melodic. It came from within the sanctum. A woman's voice, soft and mournful. The same hymn he had heard from the villagers days before. The sound was beautiful at first until the harmony fractured, splitting into 12 smaller voices, all out of rhythm. He dropped his lantern. The flames snuffed out instantly. Inside the pitch-dark courtyard, the sound grew louder. A child's laughter. Then another. Then dozens of tiny feet running along the stone floor. Mills fumbled for his matches, his hands shaking uncontrollably. When the light finally flickered to life, it illuminated the temple door, slightly open. He stepped closer. The smell hit him first, not rot, but sandalwood and flowers, as though someone had just performed a ritual. He pushed the heavy door wider and shone his light inside. The inner wall, the one where the 12 girls had been found, was different. The cracks they'd marked for study were gone. It looked newly plastered, smooth and damp, like fresh clay. And embedded into it, faintly, were handprints. Small ones. 12 of them. Mills stumbled back, his breath short. The hum began again, now directly behind him. He spun around, nothing. Just the darkness and the echo of his own heartbeat. Then, faintly, from inside the wall, a whisper. "We are still singing." He fled. The next morning, when the demolition crew arrived, the inspector was gone. His tent, his journal, his uniform, all neatly folded near the banyan tree. Only his boots remained, half sunk in the damp soil, as if he had stepped down into the earth itself. The temple was sealed once again, this time under British orders. Concrete poured over the inner sanctum. Iron gates welded shut. They posted a sign warning locals to stay away. Yet even after the demolition, people swore they could still hear children humming after sunset. Merchants passing the old road claimed they saw lamps flicker within the broken dome. And years later, when India gained independence, the story returned. Whispered among villagers and travelers alike, the 12 girls never left. Mount Devi kept her promise. Silence is her offering, and her warning. Over the next decade, the land around the temple turned barren. The banyan tree withered. Rain fell less often. The villagers moved away, leaving the temple to crumble under time. Only once, in 1931, did anyone return. A British historian searching for records of Inspector Mills discovered something shocking in the colonial archives. A final, unfiled page from Mills's missing journal. The page read, "The wall breathes. The silence has a pulse. Mount Devi is not forgotten. She only waits to be heard again." And beneath it, a single fingerprint in dried clay. A child's. It was 30 years later, in the monsoon of 1937, when the silence finally broke. Kanchipuram, now nearly abandoned, had become a ghost town swallowed by vines and dust. Only a few old families remained, those too poor or too proud to leave their ancestral homes. The temple, half collapsed and forgotten under creeping moss, stood like a sleeping beast in the heart of it all. But that year, the rains came back, and they came with fury. It began on the night of July 3rd, when thunder rolled so violently that windows shattered. Rivers flooded the narrow roads. The old temple bells, untouched for decades, began to clang by themselves, swinging in the wind as if unseen hands pulled their ropes. By morning, a landslide had carved open part of the temple's southern wall, the very side that British engineers had sealed in 1907. The villagers who saw it claimed that the landslide didn't destroy the temple. It revealed it. Among the few who still lived nearby was Leela, a widow in her 60s, who had been a young girl when the first discovery was made. She remembered the horror, the priest's silence, and the night the rain stopped. She also remembered something she had never dared to tell anyone. A dream she'd had the night Sundar vanished. In her dream, 12 little girls stood around her, holding marigolds and smiling. One of them whispered, "When the rain returns, we will too." That memory came flooding back as she watched the new storm tear the land apart. So when the lightning cracked and she saw the temple door wide open, Leela did what no one else dared. She went inside. The air was thick with moisture. Every breath burned like smoke. The once golden carvings were now blackened by decades of soot, but the faint outlines of 12 lotus symbols still shimmered beneath the grime. Leela's lantern flickered. The wind howled through the broken dome, carrying with it a familiar sound, soft humming, echoing through the chamber walls. She stepped closer. "Who's there?" she called. Her voice trembled. Then, faintly, she heard it, a child's giggle, coming from the inner sanctum. Her lantern flame wavered. She followed the sound until she stood before the wall the British had once poured over. It was cracked now, veins of damp clay spreading like roots. Water trickled down from the ceiling, glistening in the light. And then the wall moved. Just barely. A subtle shift, as though something behind it had taken a breath. Leela gasped and stepped back, her heart hammering. The humming stopped. Then a single voice, soft, fragile, unmistakably young, whispered through the cracks, "Is it morning?" The lantern slipped from her hand. The flame hit the wet floor with a hiss. Darkness swallowed the chamber. When lightning flashed again through the broken roof, Leela saw them. Tiny silhouettes pressed against the wall, their outlines glowing faintly in blue light. The next morning, the villagers found her lying near the temple steps, drenched and shivering. She was alive, but she didn't speak a word. Her eyes were open, staring at something only she could see. When the doctor arrived from Madras 2 days later, he said she showed no sign of injury, only exhaustion and shock. Yet she kept repeating one phrase again and again in a whisper. They're still waiting for the song to end. Within a week, Leela passed away in her sleep. The rain stopped once more, but that wasn't the end. A month later, while clearing debris from a landslide, workers discovered an underground passage leading from the temple's foundation toward the riverbank. It was narrow, bricked in the same ancient style as the sanctum. Inside, they found dozens of clay tablets, covered in inscriptions of the Mauna Devi hymns. But among them was something no one could explain, a fragment of a British officer's notebook, written in English. It was a torn page, soaked and faded, but a few words were still legible. "The rains are her voice. When the silence breaks, she rises again." And below it a signature, A. Mills. The handwriting was unmistakable. By then, historians had long declared Mills missing, presumed dead in 1907. But how had his journal page ended up 30 years later inside a sealed passage? The question haunted every investigator who touched the case, until one night, one of them, a young Indian archivist named Raghav Menon, stayed behind to catalog the tablets. Around midnight, during another wave of thunder, he heard it, 12 soft knocks on the table in front of him. When he looked up, the ink from the Mauna Devi tablet had begun to bleed down the stone, forming the faint outline of a child's handprint. And from the darkness outside, a single voice whispered through the storm, "Silence doesn't die. It waits." The temple of Mauna Devi was sealed again the following year, permanently this time. No one was allowed near it. But villagers still say that when the first rain of the season touches Kanchipuram, you can hear the faint hum of 12 children singing under the thunder, a lullaby older than any prayer. And sometimes, when the wind quiets, you can hear a 13th voice, a man's, whispering softly among them. Inspector Mills, still keeping watch. Time, as always, moved on, even for haunted places. By the 1940s, Kanchipuram's temple had become little more than a folklore relic. The British were gone, independence had arrived, and the new India wanted to forget the whispers of the old world, the gods who took children, the priests who disappeared, the officers who lost their minds. But silence has a strange way of surviving history. It lingers where memory refuses to fade. And in that forgotten temple of Mount Devi, silence lived on. In 1949, a team of Indian archaeologists arrived, tasked with documenting colonial-era ruins across Tamil Nadu. One of their stops was the old temple. The villagers warned them to stay away. It's cursed, they said. Even the rain avoids it now. But the team laughed it off. Science had no room for superstition. When they arrived, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of clay and ash. The banyan tree that once guarded the gate was dead, split in half by lightning. And yet, beneath its roots, the soil was damp, as if it had rained there and nowhere else. They stepped inside. The floor was slick. Dust hung like mist. Bats fluttered overhead, disturbed for the first time in decades. On the far side of the sanctum, the sealed wall still stood, cracked, chipped, but unbroken. Its surface shimmered faintly, as though moisture bled from inside. Dr. Anil Varma, the lead archaeologist, ordered his team to take samples of the plaster. When the assistant struck the wall gently with a chisel, the sound that came back was hollow, like tapping a coffin. "Strange," he muttered. "This section should be solid." The second strike echoed deeper. The third revealed a sound none of them could explain. A whisper. Not through air, but through stone. "Stop." Everyone froze. The assistant dropped his chisel. They laughed nervously, telling themselves it was wind echoing through cracks. But the word had been clear. Too clear. Dr. Verma, curious and skeptical, leaned close to the wall. His breath fogged the cold surface. He whispered back, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, faintly, a child's voice. "Mother is sleeping." The team fled the temple in terror, abandoning their equipment. When they returned the next morning, the wall bore 12 new handprints, pressed deep into the damp clay. The tools were gone, every last one. Only Verma's field notebook remained, lying open near the entrance. The last thing he had written was a single line. "Silence isn't empty. It listens." That was the final expedition ever authorized to the site. The government classified the temple as restricted heritage, its entrances sealed under concrete and barbed wire. By 1950, it had vanished from maps altogether. But the legend never died. Local fishermen say that on quiet nights, they still see a faint glow under the cracked dome, like candles flickering underwater. Travelers hear distant chanting carried by the wind. And sometimes, after heavy storms, children vanish near the riverbank, leaving behind only footprints that stop in the mud. No bodies, no screams, only silence. One summer evening in 1952, a journalist named R. Dasgupta traveled through the region researching colonial mysteries. He heard the stories, dismissed them, until a child from the nearby village approached him at dusk. The boy held a clay figurine in his hands, a small idol of a woman with no mouth. "She said to give this to you," the boy whispered. Dasgupta smiled weakly. "Who said that, son?" The boy pointed toward the temple ruins in the distance. "The one who hums when it rains." Before the journalist could ask more, thunder cracked in the sky, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. When Dasgupta looked back down, the boy was gone. Only the figurine remained cold and damp, its surface etched with 12 small fingerprints. Years later, that figurine found its way into the archives of a Chennai museum, mislabeled, forgotten, and unremarkable. But those who work late in the building whisper that when the monsoon season begins, they hear soft humming from the storage room. 12 voices, and sometimes 13. Because silence never dies. It simply waits for someone new to listen. And in the ruins of that temple in Kanchipuram, beneath the weight of 100 years of rain and dust, the goddess of silence still breathes. Her walls may be sealed. Her name may be erased. But when thunder rolls across the southern skies, the song begins again. 12 girls, 1 priest, 1 keeper, and a silence that never ends.